Inside Gaza, the brutal reality of Israel's slow-moving ground invasion. John Irvine travels into the besieged territory with Israeli soldiers to witness the scale of the destruction and the inherent dangers involved in fighting an enemy who moves around underground.
They say they found miles of tunnels and bunkers under this town, and Hamas gunmen keep appearing from these tunnels and opening fire.
And all around, all day, everywhere they went, the sound of fighting. The scale of the destruction is sobering all over again, a reminder that once this war is finished, much of northern Gaza may have been completely flattened. Also on News at 10 tonight. I won't ban it, and there are no grounds to, the Met Commissioner tells the PM the Palestinian protest march will go ahead this weekend. I wanted to sack him too. Now the former head of the civil service sticks the boot into Matt Hancock. I can't remember if Ivanka Trump follows her brother in saying she can't quite recall key correspondence in her father's fraud case, and dressing Princess Diana, one of her favourite designers, reveals the secrets behind her most iconic outfits.
We worked to a specific idea of how she should look that evening. It didn't just happen.
This is ITV News at 10 with Tom Bradby.
Good evening. If you want to see what 1 month of relentless missile strikes does to an area smaller than the Isle of Wight, then the destruction we filmed in Gaza today provides a clear idea. Ruins and rubble hardly covers it. Whole neighbourhoods, people's homes and workplaces gone in the Israeli military's quest to wipe out Hamas above and indeed below ground. Hamas are fighting like rats, one commanding officer told us. John was escorted into the deserted town of Beit Hanun in the north of Gaza by Israeli forces who supervised what we were allowed to film and to show. Their only stipulation, having seen his report, was that we protected the identity of the junior soldiers. The scale of destruction John witnessed was immense, and the sound of combat was all around and constant.
It takes about half an hour to drive from the orchards of southern Israel, first by jeep, then armoured personnel carrier, to a completely different landscape. The ruins of the Gaza Strip. We'd arrived in Beit Hanun, the northernmost town in the war zone, or at least what's left of it. These men were among the first Israeli soldiers to enter Gaza when the order finally came to cross the border 12 days ago. Their job now is to have and to hold an urban area where virtually no buildings remain intact and where combat is still taking place. Around the clock.
We're only about a kilometre from the Israeli border, and as you can hear, there's still quite a lot of fighting going on. These soldiers say they have yet to encounter any civilians. Presumably they left this neighbourhood because of the aerial bombardment.
The level of destruction was of a magnitude that reminded me of Mosul and Raqqa. And as was the case in both those cities, the enemy here can be around any corner. Some of the tanks we saw were protecting bulldozers brought in to try to clear away debris and create safe pathways through the demolished streets. Where it's too narrow for the machinery, clambering through broken buildings is the norm. The perils of urban warfare are all too obvious here. The men know that some of their colleagues are in the few high buildings still standing, providing covering fire. During our stay, the sound of battle was constant. This is the reality of a slow-moving ground war that's made even slower by what lies below.
We've got a pretty big IDF security detail with us because they're worried about tunnels. They say they've found miles of tunnels and bunkers under this town, and Hamas gunmen keep appearing from these tunnels and opening fire.
This is one of the many tunnels they have discovered.
This is the way they act. They stay inside the tunnel for many days and waiting, and after that they go out and making the attack.
The commanding officer described the so-called metro beneath Bet Hanun as a city under a city.
We saw it, we feel it. They are fighting like that, like rats.
Most of Israel's wars were over in days, but these soldiers say they don't care how long this one takes. All of them know someone who was killed, kidnapped or wounded in the surprise Hamas attack that this Israeli offensive is meant to ensure never happens again.
John is now back in Tel Aviv. John, that looked like a fairly unnerving day and very much like a battle still in progress to me. What were your impressions?
Good evening, Tom. I think what I find shocking but not necessarily surprising is just the level of destruction and damage. I literally didn't see a single building that's still intact. Now that's not surprising because we know that since this war broke out, the Israeli Air Force has been carrying out the most heavy bombing campaign over Gaza ever. One of the things I did find surprising was just the sheer intensity of the fighting that's still going on relatively close to the Israeli border. Bet Hanun, Tom, we were about a kilometre away from that border. I'd assumed it would have been conquered and pacified by the Israelis by now, but that's simply not the case. Now, one of the reasons for that is this tunnel network that we hear so much about. The troops we talk to are very wary about these tunnels. They keep finding the entrances and are not quite sure what to do. The Israeli army doctrine says soldiers don't go into the tunnels right now for fear of booby traps and ambush. So what are they supposed to do? Hamas claims there are 300 miles of tunnels under the Gaza Strip. The Israelis might try to smoke people out. They might try to starve them out. I suspect going forward there will be a siege element to the Israeli offensive, which means, Tom, this could go on for a while, months probably.
OK, John, thank you very much indeed. Well, having heard from John what little is left of Bet Hanun in northern Gaza, it's little wonder that tens of thousands of Palestinians are on the move, heading south. An estimated 70% of Gaza's 2.3 million population have left their homes in the past month. It is little wonder, too, that Israel's allies from the G7 called today for a humanitarian pause in the fighting to get aid in. If there were to be a pause, Rohit has been told somewhere between 10 and 15 hostages could be released if talks are successful.
The exit from northern Gaza today. People finding any way to get out, carrying rucksacks and carrier bags and anything else they could. Some were elderly. A woman pushed by a man wearing well-worn sandals. But to look down this road is to see that Gaza is a young place. Half its population is under 18.
We moved to the schools, but the schools were also not safe. We didn't have food or drinking water. There wasn't drinking water for our children. There is no life in Gaza.
At the Rafah crossing, a visit by the UN's human rights chief. He said war crimes had been committed by Hamas and by Israel, which he added was guilty of the collective punishment of the people of Gaza.
The lifeline has been unjustly, outrageously thin. These are the gates to a living nightmare.
A vigil in Jerusalem for those being held inside Gaza. It's the release of some of the hostages, which could now lead to a pause in the fighting. Tonight, a source told ITV News that negotiations are ongoing to release 10 to 15 hostages in exchange for a pause of up to 2 days. A second source said Americans would be included. And talks had been held up because the hostages are scattered across different locations and held by more than one group. But this evening, the Israeli Prime Minister said once again, there will be no ceasefire without releasing our hostages. 1 month and 1 day into its war, Israel appears to be moving towards fulfilling its early objectives. It released footage today of its engineers blowing up tunnels within the strip. But more consequential than what happens here is the fighting within the city, much of which now appears to have been cut off from the south of the Gaza Strip. The United States chief diplomat is finding the diplomacy difficult. In Japan today, as Israel continues to say what it intends to do, he was left to make clear what it won't.
Israel cannot occupy Gaza. Now, the reality is that there may be a need for some transition period.
Hopes then for a pause in the fighting, but we've heard that optimism before. Rohit Katru, News at 10, Tel Aviv.
Well, back here, there was for a time today something of a standoff between the Prime Minister and the head of London's Metropolitan Police over the pro-Palestinian demonstration planned for Saturday, Armistice Day. Of course, Sir Mark Rowley has said last night that he would not ban the demonstration. There were no grounds to do so, he said. This morning, Mr Sunak took issue with that and said he'd hold Sir Mark responsible for what happens on Saturday.
This is a decision that the Metropolitan Police Commissioner has made, and he has said that he can ensure that he safeguards remembrance for the country this weekend, as well as keep the public safe. Now, my job is to hold him accountable for that, and we've asked the police for information on how they will ensure that this happens.
This afternoon, there was a slight rowing back by the Prime Minister. He said that whilst holding the pro-Palestinian protest was disrespectful, part of the freedom fought for by previous generations is the right to peaceful protest. Robert is in his studio, ready for tonight's Peston programme. Robert, after putting pressure on the Met and organisers, it does feel like this is something of a climb down from Rishi Sunak. Is that right or not?
Well, it's certainly very confusing. You have heard from the Prime Minister, very uncomfortable about the talk going ahead, seemingly putting pressure on the police to stop it. But, you know, we have a great British tradition that people can protest peacefully. It's part of the freedoms, and Rishi Sunak himself has pointed this out, part of the freedoms that people fought for in 2 world wars. And we're, of course, commemorating those people who made the ultimate sacrifice in those world wars to preserve our freedom. So, in the end, the logical position for the Prime Minister to take is that if the police think there is no threat to life, no prospect of really important laws being broken as a result of these protests, then of course they should go ahead. Now, you know, it's fine for any citizen, including the Prime Minister and indeed the Home Secretary, to say that they're uncomfortable with all of this. But in the end, unless they want to change the law, this is an operational matter for the police, and the police have made it clear that they do not think lives or indeed important laws are in jeopardy here. So the Prime Minister sort of ended up where you would expect him to end up.
OK, Robert, thank you very much indeed. And Robert's programme, always so much of interest on there, but there is so much to discuss at the moment, and it's coming up just shortly after the news. So do stay tuned for that. Now, the head of the Metropolitan Police isn't the only person under pressure from the fallout from the Middle East. The conflict in the Labour Party has edged up another notch, with Sir Keir Starmer refusing to budge from his support for a pause not a ceasefire. That's despite the first resignation by a shadow junior minister over what he called a substantial difference with Sakir's position. Imran Hussain was the shadow minister for the New Deal for working people.
Side by side, they stand united on their Gaza policy. But while the leader of the opposition is in agreement with the Prime Minister, he doesn't seem to have the same level of support from some within his own party. A third of his MPs have opposed his position, more than 35 councillors have resigned, and now a member of his front bench has stepped down. Imran Hussain, in his resignation letter, said, "Given the crisis unfolding, I wish to be a strong advocate for the humanitarian ceasefire advocated by the UN. It is clear that I cannot sufficiently, in all good conscience, do this from the front bench, given its current position." He had been vocal about his stance in recent weeks.
The innocent blood continues to be spilled on the streets of Gaza.
But his resignation is partly due to a toughening up of Labour's position. Mr Hussain, who represents Bradford East, was told if he signed a parliamentary motion calling for a ceasefire, he would be sacked. He stepped down and did it anyway, and the local constituents we spoke to were broadly supportive. Today in the Commons, despite the warning, shadow ministers, some passionately, continued to call for a ceasefire.
When will the UK ramp up its effort to end the bloodshed and ensure Palestinian children just have the right to live?
For lasting peace, we must inevitably reach the point of a ceasefire.
And frustrations from constituents are still reaching MPs' inboxes.
Every MP has had a large amount of correspondence on this. I was in the chamber earlier, a Conservative was saying that she had never seen as many emails on one subject in 13 years. So for me, they're coming in the inbox, I think, more than Brexit, more than Partygate.
But despite the emails and protests, Labour remain adamant that calling for a humanitarian pause, the position of both the government and the US, is the right strategy.
I know colleagues feel strongly about it. We all do. We see horrifying images on our television screens every day. We saw the brutality and the barbarity of the terrorist attacks on the 7th of October. We're all moved by that. We all want to see progress. We all want violence to stop. But what Keir Starmer is setting out is a credible plan around how we make sure that more aid gets in.
Labour's Gaza policy has caused significant tension within the party, and the leadership will now be hoping that more resignations don't follow. Shihab Khan, News at 10, Westminster.
For Britain's long-suffering train passengers, there could be light at the end of the tunnel in the long-running pay dispute involving the RMT union. Its members may decide not to strike over Christmas. No deal has been agreed yet, but a way forward has been. It could mean a backdated pay rise and promises on job security.
We've got an unconditional offer, but the offer is still way below the rate of inflation, which is why we can't recommend it. There'll be a lot of back pay for our members because they haven't had a pay rise for so long, and we've still got to do with pay issues this year for the 23 year and for next year, which is coming up quickly over the horizon. So there's a lot to do, but this will allow us to put it to our members, and then we can have some industrial peace, at least for the next 6 months.
The full interview, of course, on Robert's show. Now, evidence at the COVID inquiry has already illuminated the lack of regard for the Health Secretary at the time, Matt Hancock, amongst officials in government. And that's putting it pretty politely. Today, another, the then head of the Civil Service, Lord Sedwill, said he wanted Mr Hancock sacked too, over issues of truthfulness, as he put it. Lord Sedwill told the inquiry he made his feelings clear to Boris Johnson, who was the Prime Minister then.
Stay at home to protect the NHS and to save lives.
He was the man who told us this repeatedly during the pandemic. Now, the UK's most senior civil servant at the time has told the inquiry he advised the Prime Minister Matt Hancock should be replaced as Health Secretary.
How damaging, how destructive this loss of confidence in Mr Hancock was.
Clearly damaging. I did raise really 3 questions with the Prime Minister throughout those months. One was about Mr Hancock's candour.
Lord Sedwill said he had to get others to check what Mr Hancock promised and finally concluded this.
You told the Prime Minister to sack Mr Hancock.
I don't think I used that word with him, but I did use it in a WhatsApp with Simon Case.
And you described it thus: to save lives and protect the NHS.
That was gallows humour.
Few are laughing at the picture of extreme chaos surrounding the Prime Minister and his closest advisor Dominic Cummings, as described to the inquiry. In a WhatsApp exchange shown today, Simon Case, another senior civil servant, writes, "It's like taming wild animals. Nothing in my past experience has prepared me for this madness. The PM and the people he chooses to surround himself with are basically feral." Mark Sedwill replies, "I have the bite marks." Lord Sedwill, who was eventually replaced himself by the Prime Minister, didn't escape criticism today, admitting he had indeed suggested in early March 2020 that people could be encouraged to catch COVID in chickenpox-style parties.
I do understand the distress that must have caused, and I apologise for that.
Mr Hancock has become a lightning rod for criticism at this inquiry. Dominic Cummings has already argued he thought he should have been sacked. And now we have the two most senior civil servants at the time agree that what the Health Secretary said could not always be trusted. There are a lot of people at the inquiry trying to protect their reputations. Mr Hancock is going to have a lot of defending to do.
The Prime Minister has stated he didn't have any concerns about Mr Hancock's performance. Both men will have the chance to try to account for their pandemic actions in the coming weeks. Romilly Weeks, News at 10.
When people living near a chemical plant in a quiet part of Texas were told to stay indoors, they only needed to take one look out of the window to see why. This is what they saw. A big fire at the plant sent vast clouds of smoke funneling into the sky. People for a mile around were locked down. Now, still in the US, it was the turn today of former President Trump's daughter Ivanka to defend the family business in court against claims that the value of the Trump organization was fraudulently inflated. She told the court in New York she had nothing to do with her father's financial statements. And Dan is following the case. Dan, this feels like the case where no one can remember anything.
Yeah, it does feel a bit like that, Tom, doesn't it? This was the fourth member of the Trump family to appear, and Ivanka was actually compelled to appear, subpoenaed. She obviously didn't want to be in this courtroom, to be associated with this alleged fraud whatsoever. The phrase over and over again, as you mentioned, I can't recall, I can't remember, when she was questioned. The one thing that she was very clear about, though, was that she had nothing to do with the financial statements of Donald Trump, which grossly overvalued his property empire to get preferential interest rates. But Letitia James, the Attorney General for New York, who's brought this case, was very clear before proceedings this morning that Ivanka was actually at the heart of many of the deals with the banks.
Ms. Trump will do all that she can to try to separate herself from this corporation, but she's inextricably tied to the Trump organization and to these properties that she helped secure financing for. So you cannot hide from the truth.
What is at the heart of this case really is Donald Trump's net worth, which he claimed at one point to be over $4 billion. That has been widely criticised in this case as being completely untrue, and that's been largely accepted by the judge in this case. There is no jury, so it's not looking very good for the Trump organisation, and on the line really is his entire property empire. Not only that, but potentially he might be banned from operating a business in New York in the future.
OK, Dan, thank you very much indeed. Well, back here, the incredible work done by homeless charities is tough going at the best of times. Factor in cuts in funding from the Labour government in Wales, rising prices and rising demand, and charities there say they are running on empty and on the point of collapse. 40% say that if funding doesn't go up, they won't be able to carry out their work.
Cardiff is a tough place to be homeless on a damp and cold November night. Most don't give the city's rough sleepers a second glance. But these volunteers are working hard to help as many as possible.
Do you want a hot meal?
They say there's been a huge increase in demand since the pandemic.
It's tripled, basically, so 30 would be a busy night for us. Yeah. But now, in the last 6 months, we are seeing at least 80 people on a night out.
They may be statistics, but they all have a story. Gareth became homeless after being handed a no-fault eviction.
He made me pack a bag, and then I had to leave with just a few items of clothing and that, and then I just walked, queued up at a homeless centre. There's no space. There's some good people. They're like decent people on the streets and stuff, you know, who just had a rough time, and some that haven't really got a voice to, like, they don't know where to go to ask for help.
Those who've been homeless for decades, like Angel, say the situation has never been so bad.
So what about us homeless people? You know, we are dying. Everyone's dying on the streets of Cardiff because no one's there to help us.
Homeless services in Wales are funded by a Welsh Government grant, but it's more than 12% lower in real terms than a decade ago, despite an increase in demand. Charities are now facing the financial reality of this contradiction.
We knew that things were very, very difficult in the sector at the moment, but actually it feels as though we're on the brink of system collapse if we don't see an increase in funding for the housing support grant.
In a document shared exclusively with ITV News, 75% of homeless service providers say they're running statutory services at a loss, with 52% using their emergency reserves. 40% say they'll be forced to hand back existing contracts without more funding.
Well, we can't keep doing it. So you will lose organisations. We already have lost charities in Wales, and we'll have to step away from work that we can't make work financially.
Would anyone like a snack?
The Welsh Government says it recognises the immense pressures facing frontline services, but froze its housing support grant due to an extraordinarily difficult budgetary position. But the fear for those charities on the front line is that another funding freeze this winter could prove fatal for the homelessness sector and those they're fighting to protect. Rhys Williams, News at 10, Cardiff.
Finally, in her post-divorce life, Princess Diana dressed a little less like a royal and in a more overtly glamorous way. Some of those final statement dresses were designed by Jacques Azaguri, who is now about to retire. He has put up for sale replicas of his iconic creations, saying the time has come for someone else to treasure and enjoy them.
Princess Diana's style made her one of the world's most photographed women. Her dresses, especially in her final 2 years, part of those iconic images. That Diana look was shaped in large part by designer Jacques Azaguri. He captured her confidence and glamour, presenting it with simplicity, and the results were always dazzling.
They're the most iconic of the dresses. You know, when we think of Diana, that's how we see her, as a super confident person again, which she wasn't for a long time. It obviously comes through in the dresses. Every single time I met her, I got excited at the prospect of seeing her and chatting. And, you know, we always had quite a laugh together.
Jacques' famous collection has just been sold to an American museum. It includes the black dress he designed for Diana to wear to a charity fundraiser on the evening her Panorama interview was broadcast.
She said, you know, Jacques, I've done this interview, you know, I'm only explaining what's actually happened, and then obviously we got round to choosing a dress. We worked to a specific idea of how she should look that evening. It didn't just happen.
Jacques used to close his Knightsbridge shop when Diana visited. He remembers her reaction when customers knocked on the door, oblivious to who was inside.
She said, oh, let them in, Jacques. And they'd come in, she said, go and deal with them and then come back to me. You know, it's not what you expect, really. That's why I say, you know, that's how humble and courteous she was.
Jacques will never part with this gift Diana sent him when she left for her fateful trip to Paris.
She called me and she said, Jacques, I have a parcel for you. As you can see, it's 3 of the famous 5 dresses that she chose herself, saying, Dearest Jacques, lots of love, Diana. It feels like it was almost a goodbye present, you know. That's why I will always treasure it. It's really too close to my heart.
Neil Connery, News at 10.
That's all we have time for. Our top story tonight, John Irvine's remarkable account of the scale of destruction, but also of the ongoing fighting in Gaza. I'll be back same time tomorrow. Until then, good night. Thanks for watching.